because I know we're going to have a lot of questions, and I want to make sure our speakers have enough time to speak. My name is Tanya Casas. I am the Academic Director of Graduate Policy Studies here. I'm also an Associate Professor of Sociology, and I want to welcome you to this panel, Land and Indigenous Peoples. It is a topic that's very dear to my heart. I've done a lot of work where my family's from in Ecuador, and later maybe I'll talk about why this is dear to me. But more than anything, I'm most interested in what our speakers have to say. We have Chris Stainbrook from the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, Daniel Salau Roge from the Simba Maasai Outreach Organization, and Ted Pahola, the founder of Indigenous Design and Planning Institute. And we are going to start with Chris Stainbrook. Thank you.
Yami Washte Yapaha Mitaye Wukasa Wahinuba Chris Stainbrook. Good morning, my name is Chris Stainbrook. My family is from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in southwest South Dakota. A couple of things. It's going to be a little bit difficult for me to stand at the podium and give this whole presentation because in Indian country you always want to stay on the move, right? That way nobody gets a clean shot at me. There are a few things that I want to warn you about, having now sat in one of the sessions this morning. This will not be your typical high-level academic talk. I quit doing that in the mid-1980s after I received my master's in fishery science and went out and worked for the tribes on the Columbia River and discovered that academics and biology had nothing to do with management of fish. Everything was politics and how do you engage people and create mindsets, if you will. One of the pieces that we have been doing at the foundation for the past 13 years of our existence has been changing people's mindsets. And this morning, one of the pieces that I would like to do is begin going back and changing the education that you had about Indian country. Because much of it, if you're like 99% of the people in the nation, most of your Indian education came on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. and it's very limited. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the foundation does to undo that, but first I want to get started on it because Tanya sent me a message, said we've talked for 15 minutes and then we'll have questions. As I start putting these things together, they always get longer than I hope. But I'm going to blaze through some stuff today. Land and the American Dream, right? And it's, for Indian country, it's really been more of a nightmare than it has been a dream. And so that's why the title. So this was Indian country before the coming of the Europeans. And you can see that it's not, you won't find state lines in here anywhere. It was pretty much divided by linguistics and culture and the families. This morning you heard about the Blackfeet and the area that they used. I have to say very quickly, that's the smallest Blackfeet area, perceived area I've ever seen. My friend Eloise Cabell and my other Blackfeet friend Ross Racine assured me that the Blackfeet inhabited land all the way probably to the Great Lakes and then probably as far south as what is now Denver, Colorado, and as far north as the Arctic Circle. And so we kid around about some of that in Indian country. And as long as they push the crow out of the area, we're fine from the Oglala side, right? So this is what you saw, and you saw it across the country. These division lines are not hard and fast. It was a fluid type of arrangement among all the tribal groups. Now this is more what you typically see as Indian country if you were looking at a presentation that's more of the mainstream type presentation. Now I will assure you that when the map maker did this, there was a little dot right about in here that was the 20 acres that the Pilgrims had in 1620. The rest of it was all Indian country, and it was divided the way I showed you. But we put the state lines in here because the following slides begin to give you some orientation to where things went. So after the initial colonies were established in this country, you could see that the push was inward a little bit and toward the south. This was the initiation of the treaty-making period, and the treaty-making period, of course, was a matter of expediency. It was not about anything other than that. You could have wars, you could have people getting killed. At the time, there weren't that many Europeans, and so they were somewhat outnumbered, and it was to make these treaties. That treaty period lasted for more than 130 years, and some of those treaties are still in effect today from our perspective. Then we had the big push inward coming off of the coast, and we had the Trail of Tears was in 1830 after the Indian Removal Act was signed, and there was a mindset that this was a country that was open for development or open for discovery, and the doctrine of discovery was confirmed by the Supreme Court in their minds in 1829, 1831, and 1833 in what's called the Marshall Trilogy. And as it turns out, as you go back and look at the Marshall Trilogy, Chief Justice Marshall was actually aware that he had made a drastic mistake in that and spent the remainder of his life waiting for the court case to come along that he could reverse it. Unfortunately, he died in, I think, 1835 or 1836 before a case ever got to him. But if you read his writings, you will see that, in fact, he was looking for that case. This was all based on a mindset, right? And the mindset looked something like this from Andrew Jackson. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, prosperous farms, occupied by 12 million happy people and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. First time I saw this, I thought, well, you know, that might work for some people. And I have to tell you, sometimes we have a different point of view on this. And so we created this statement. What good man would prefer a country covered with concrete and asphalt, 380 million people, to our original native nations covered with prairies, forests studded with clean water, etc., and occupied by, we still like that 12 million happy people. It's just maybe a different people than you're expecting. But this is one of the things I want to do with that and laying that out for you is get you to start thinking about the different perspectives that are out there. Not just non-Indian, Indian perspectives, but the many perspectives that are out there. Not everyone has to come or coalesce behind a single perspective, but it's beginning to understand other people and how they look at the actions that we all take. So that then, of course, drew the line more or less at the Mississippi River. In 1803, we had, of course, had the Lewis and Clark expedition through the Great Plains and up through the northern Rockies and up the coast. One of the things that, of course, happened was we had gold discovered in what is today California and Oregon. and we started seeing a push from the West Coast at that point. There were 3 appropriation acts that really accelerated the loss of native land, including the Appropriation Act, the Immigrant Stampede in Oklahoma area, and then, of course, the Homestead Act. Those 3 together, generally, we lost about 140 million acres of Indian land. Now, all of that was in another mindset, right? And I understand this picture went up yesterday. When I can tell you the first time I saw this picture, I was in 6th grade. My grandfather had taken one of the old assimilation transfers from Pine Ridge to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I grew up in central Iowa. I saw this picture for the first time when I was in 6th grade. It raised for me the question of, did my great-grandfather not run fast enough? Why are we still in Iowa? And it's one of those things when you're in 6th grade, that's a tough thing, because you figure, well, the buffalo ran fast enough, but then they got shot. The wildlife there's no wildlife in Iowa. Right? But somehow we were still in Iowa. You know, the angelic figure, the whole works. I mean, this is a depiction of the mindset. If you think this mindset is out of the American public today, I would tell you you're wrong. This mindset is still very much alive in the American psyche, and this will still be found in history books even today. Eventually, this is where we ended up. 400 treaties, some number of executive orders later, we had reservations throughout the West. Basically, the northern woodlands, and out throughout the West. Oklahoma was declared Indian country, and you have a number of tribes that have been removed to Oklahoma from the east. There are still a few spots where we've got some land holdings in the east. There are a few things I would say about this. First off, the map maker tried to move Cheyenne and Northern Cheyenne and Crow into Canada. The Canadians wouldn't have them either. And the map is a little bit off, but that's not what I want for you to understand. If you look at a map, a road map, a Rand McNally map, you will see the boundaries to the original reservations as today. So if you're looking at driving in across northern Minnesota, for instance, you'll see a Leech Lake Reservation. And most people immediately think this whole thing is a reservation. And in many ways it is. But if you take a closer look at the land ownership inside that reservation, which is about 900,000 acres, maybe, well, the original was 1.2 million acres, only 4% of that land is owned by Indian people in the tribe. The remainder has been lost, and it's been lost through essentially the practices of the General Allotment Act in 1887, or what's known as the Dawes Allotment Act. And this is one of those pieces that not many non-natives really think about very often. And yet it was one of the great takings. I mean, it was a land taking is what that act amounted to. And I'll show you the process in a second. More than 150 of the reservations were allotted, including most of the large ones. And the allotment process started in 87. There are a couple that were done before that. There's 34 acts addressing individual tribes. So in Minnesota, all the tribes were allotted under what was called the Nelson Act. But they all had the same provisions. So head of families would get anywhere between 40 and 320 acres assigned to them from the tribal land estate. And when that land was allotted out, the remaining land on the reservation was declared in excess of Indian needs and taken by the federal government. Now, the tribes were paid at that point pennies on the dollar for that land, and then literally pennies on the dollar. That ultimately, between that and losses of the individual allotments, we ended up losing the 90 million acres inside of the reservation boundaries. if you look at virtually any treaty that was written, there's a clause in there that makes it very clear that those treaty lands were for the exclusive use and occupation by Indian people, with the exception of oftentimes an acre for the blacksmith, an acre for the school teacher, and an acre for the agency. And so, you know, this was exclusive use and occupation. The treaty stopped in 1871. 16 years later, they got opened up by the Dawes General Allotment to take it. The treaties are protected by the Constitution of the United States as the supreme law of the land. And, you know, those violations have occurred. Let me show you. This, of course, is one of the great, this is like the conversation the other day around why do we have the Benghazi Committee, right? So it wasn't about this. Ostensibly, the Dawes Act was about making farmers out of Indian people in the European sense. You'd have this land, you'd farm it, you'd be able to live, you'd be like the Europeans. Well, it wasn't much about that anyway. It was really about getting rid of the tribes and the tribal entities. And so without the land, the tribe had no real existence, had no governance, basically. And Theodore Roosevelt summed it up much the way that the speaker did the other day. The General Allotment Act is a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. I will tell you, this is a mindset too that has not left the American psyche. People, and what's even, I think, more frightening to a good many Indian people is that it has been fully ingrained in American Indian psyche as well. So when we talk about allotments returning to the tribe and not being held by individuals, there is an outcry in Indian country about that. And it's one that when I do landowner trainings throughout the country, we probably do 40 or 50 a year at different tribes. You point out to folks that in fact all of the land protected by the treaty was tribal land. The tribes made the treaties, not individuals. And it really distresses a number of Indian people. This is a Flathead Reservation in northwest Montana. In fact, you can see maybe right there is where it's located in the state of Montana. This was a treaty of Hell's Gate in 1885, guaranteed this land to the exclusive use and occupation by Indian people. The allotments were made on the reservation. In this case, they were able to ask for certain areas, and you can see all the squares are 160 acres, and this is primarily in the valley area, and this is the high mountain meadows basically up here, and you see they're along the river. Once that happened, there was the declaration of all lands in excess being open to homesteading, and you can see the white and the gray are all the homesteads that were made on the reservation. And what's really a rub, this is the National Bison Range. So when the allotment process was taking place at Salish Kootenai, they had a remnant bison herd, and they could see that it was in danger, so they sent it to Canada, right? And they managed it up in Canada. This part of the country, apparently, no one really wanted to settle in, so the federal government took it, and they didn't know what they were going to do with it, so they brought these buffalo back down from Canada and put them on, declared this is held in the United States estate, land estate. And for years, it's been home to the bison, right? Well, the tribe has been trying to take over the management of that bison population for quite some time. We're now almost there. We're almost there after about 40 years of trying. Who are we being fought by? the federal workers that work there. They're pretty sure that the Flathead, the Salish and Kootenai people are going to go out and shoot all their buffalo and just eat them. Let me see. They moved them to Canada. Are they likely to go out there tomorrow and butcher them all? Probably not. Here's the other thing that you need to know. When the Dawes allotment passed, it had a blanket declaration of all Indian people as incompetent to handle their own affairs across the board, and the tribes as well. So all of the land that was taken, all of the land was taken, and it was taken from tribal ownership to U.S. ownership and held in trust for Indian people. That's the legacy that we live with today. So if you have one of these allotments and you decide that what you would like to do is give that to your heir, or you would like to lease it out, you have to get the Secretary of the Interior's approval for that. Oftentimes that process is 2 or 3 years. In some cases it can be much longer than that. So when groups come together and they say, well, why don't we do some planning with the tribes and we'll talk about land use planning in this area. It's not only complicated by the fact that you have several jurisdictions. So you've got a federal jurisdiction here, you've got really federal jurisdiction on part of it, but it's through the tribe. And all of the white and gray spaces in here are under state and county jurisdiction. The fee land on the reservation. So when you want to talk about, do we preserve an area anywhere on that map, pick an area anywhere on that map, you have to begin bringing all these pieces together. It's always interesting to come back east and have these talks because the politics between the east and the west are very different. Counties have fought tooth and nail with the tribes over not only jurisdiction issues, but some very fundamental issues like should the tribe own land, and because they lose a tax base if the tribe has the land.
Going back to the Allotment Act, my great-grandparents might have picked up a 160-acre allotment or 640 acres. When they passed on, and let's say they had 4 children, those land interests were divided by 4. And when those people passed on and they had children, the land was further divided. And if there wasn't a will or some mechanism for allocating the land interest, over and over again, you had a continued division into smaller and smaller pieces. So take a pie, divide it in half, divide it in a quarter, divide it in eighths, divide it in 16th, 1/32, 1/64. All of a sudden, how much a piece of the pie do you have? You don't have a lot of pieces of the pie, but you still have an interest.
So what Phil Baird is explaining there is the legacy of a lot and the trust. So the 160 acres, or whatever size the allotment was, 320 or 80, was owned by the original allottee. But because they were in trust, they were not competent. They could not write a will. And the federal government didn't write a will, so it came up with this process, said we'll keep the land intact and we'll divide the title among the heirs. So today, this is the final picture there with whatever it was, 128 little Phil Bairds on the screen. That's not even close. We're averaging somewhere around 450 owners per 160 acre allotment. Now, can you imagine? You come to Thanksgiving dinner, right? With, let's say, 480 of your closest relatives. Who in this group knows 480 of your relatives? Then try and decide how you're going to use your land. That's the problem. And so what we see in Indian country, and I'll show you some of the statistics on this, is we basically see land being unused because no one can get to that point. So today we've got about 57 million surface, subsurface acres. in trust and restricted fee. 10 million of that's in individual trust. We have 3.2 million undivided interests. And these are undivided, like water in a glass. And people have to come to at least 50% agreement in order to do anything with that land. We have 47 million acres back in tribal trust, and this has been a long-term proposition to get it there, because after the Allotment Act, virtually, we probably had something like 25 to 30 million acres, and 17 million have been added. We don't know how much is in fee land. Reservation land masses across the country range from the Navajo Reservation at 16 million acres down to a 1.3 acre reservation in California, which is essentially the cemetery. Most of it's farming and ranching, and I will tell you most of farming and ranching lands are leased out because of fractionation, and they are not managed by Indian people, nor does the income come off of that. The income will go to on the lease, but the predominance of wealth is accruing to non-Indians. So here's our version of Manifest Destiny. We had an artist that was in the office, and I said, I want a picture that's the opposite of that. This is what the foundation works on. We don't want all the country back, but what we want are those lands inside the original reservation boundaries back in Indian management, ownership, and control. This is how I feel as I do a 20-minute presentation on this subject. I can tell you, I showed this at the University of Wisconsin one time, and this woman comes up to me afterwards. She goes, you know, that is the strangest picture, and I can't take my eyes off it. We tell folks this is the new environmental horse. It only has half the impact on the ground. You can get a hold of me if you would like to at this address and email. Thank you.
I'll be talking of land and indigenous peoples, particularly focusing on the communal ownership, regulation and commodification of land in the context of indigenous peoples, particularly the Maasai community of Kenya. That is the map of Kenya. Seeing something pointing at that, and more. All right. The Maasai occupy this area originally all the way from central Kenya all the way down to central Tanzania. That is way before these boundaries were put in place by the Europeans at the turn of the 19th century. And this was, of course, put deliberately to weaken the communities. That was one of the colonial strategies of weakening the communities. And so this boundary had to run, this is between Kenya and Tanzania, had to run right across Maasai land. But yeah. So before the coming of the Europeans in around 1890s, the Maasai region was somewhere between central Kenya and central Tanzania. All this region was initially the original territory of the Maasai. But speaking of indigenous peoples, of which the Maasai are part of, the wider indigenous peoples populations, which is perhaps a bit easy to understand in the American context, because the Red Indians are, the American natives in this land, and many people came to take over their land, as we have been shown just a moment ago. But in Africa, it's quite different, because everybody belongs there, and if you talk of who is indigenous, who is more indigenous than not, and not the other, you'd be asked, we were also here. But the United Nations had given some distinct differences between who is considered indigenous peoples more than the others. And these are some of the benchmarks that were put in place by the United Nations, that these are people who, up until now, are still bordering on their natural environment and are so much dependent on land and natural resources for their day-to-day lives. They also have a strong social cultural ties, in the way that they relate to the nature and to each other. So they are also politically and economically marginalized in the modern day society. Because as you have seen now, we have modern Kenya as a country also, with a defined governance structure and a government in place. But the participation of indigenous peoples, and particularly the Maasai and many other groups, there are other groups in Kenya also indigenous, in the day-to-day running of the government is so limited. And so they are vulnerable both politically and economically. It's also an issue of self-identity. So we identify ourselves as so. And the Maasai therefore fit into this definition of the United Nations. I just picked this bit because I've talked about the United Nations, and that is where we, the indigenous peoples, and particularly the Maasai, have come to negotiate, like in a common platform with the government and many other governments of the world and indigenous peoples of the world generally. Because it's hard to negotiate back at home with our governments. That's the distinction. It's so hard to access some of these governments. But finding an avenue such as the United Nations was really a breakthrough for indigenous peoples. And many years of negotiations and highlighting of the issues and marginalization has led to the realization of the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples' Rights. That is the meaning of that, which defines who indigenous peoples are and their rights relative to their land and natural resources. So this was adopted in 2007. But I'm finding commonalities because we are talking of land and American dream. And Kenya also had a dream, which at independence was to eradicate poverty, disease, and ignorance. But over the years, this dream has been derailed. And we have been more and more following our big brother, that is American West, the West generally, in so many aspects. So coming to the United Nations, Kenya and the US did not really so much for this idea of empowering more of indigenous peoples. And therefore they abstained. Kenya abstained, they didn't vote for, which was very obvious because they were not really for this. And US really voted against that. Another commonality is that, and why they did that is because there is that interest, of course, of always pursuing this ideology of capitalism and looking land as a commodity, to make profit. And everything else around land and natural resources is being looked at that perspective of profiteering and how much it contributes financially to the gross domestic product. And there's also a common fear of the renaissance of indigenous peoples. Issues to do with repatriations, issues to do with restitution. And even in some cases, like in Africa, indigenous peoples are calling for secession, like we want to have our own independent states. And so these were the fears that were common. And also, they were also fearful of this principle, which really underlines this document, and that is the principle of prior informed consent. Being informed of what do you want to do with your lands, with your natural resources, what do you want to do with your destiny. So there was fear running along them. And coming back to the land question, the Maasai, looking at my brother's presentation, is very similar to the Maasai case, the Maasai situation. Because, as I had explained earlier, on that map, the Maasai really occupy a very huge percentage of the country. But at the stroke of a pen, they lost about 11,000 square miles of their land to the British, who wanted this land for farming and, do their own activities. So this came, of course, as a result of forceful evictions during the colonial era. And soon, after we got independence, the post-colonial era, which I call it also neo-colonialism, because they were pursuing the same interests as the colonialists. And one of the interests is to get more and more land, commercialize it as much as possible, commercialize all the natural resources that are there. And so they were just following in their footsteps. And the post-colonial era, which is a modern-day independent Kenya, used policy and law. There are a lot of acts that you had shown, and there are so many also in our case, of trying to demarcate the land. Part of it is, first of all, is to alienate these lands and use it as conservation areas, as so-called government gazetted areas. Like this hill here is just right behind my village, and the community right now cannot access these hills because it's a gazetted government land. And despite the importance of these hills, as a grazing area and as a mountain whereby the communities do their own spiritual activities and all that, and cultural activities, they have limited access and use of it. So these are some of the laws that were put to alienate these lands. Some of them have got to create parks, conservation areas. We are all, probably dreaming one day to go to visit Masai Mara, to visit Amboseli, and we really feel happy after that holiday. But that is also a nightmare to us as the Maasais, as much as it is really a good thing to Kenya as a government, and maybe to the discerning tourists who want to go there. But people who are deprived of that land, they cannot access for grazing. And the whole concept of separating nature from people is really a colonial mindset, that biodiversity cannot thrive where people are, which subsequent researches have shown otherwise, actually, because there is a lot of reduction of biodiversity in protected areas compared to the areas where wildlife and people, roam and live together. And so that's how it came. They came to lose huge chunks of those lands. And in the current case, we have privatization of land, subdivision into individual titles, title holding, as opposed to the communal holding, which was the case. And soon after independence, the 1967 Group Ranches Act was passed in Kenya, which ensured that the Maasai communities have to live in group ranches. Then subsequently, the Private Land Ownership Act was also passed, which requires every individual, and we are going to get into maybe those smaller units of land as time goes by. So a huge part of, maybe now as we speak, half of Maasai land is still under group ranches, and half of it is currently under individual ownership. So already we are experiencing a very big loss, because this then opened the commercial market for land, willing seller, willing buyer. And with the pressure from Nairobi, you have seen in the map that we are really just bordering Nairobi, and there is huge pressure and demand for land. And people having a lot of money in Nairobi, they can come and they can buy, because it's easy now to negotiate with an individual. It was hard to negotiate with a community, because they have strong customary laws that safeguards the land. So this makes it easy to lose land and to lose natural resources that they are in those lands. Corporates are coming in and extracting these resources, and so the whole weapon here is money, Kenya shilling. Okay, so that's a modern day way of losing it, and we are foreseeing a future whereby we will continue to lose more land when the taxation regime is adopted. That's where we are getting, because I know that's an issue also in America, that you have to pay tax on land. It's not the case in our situation as yet, but that's where we are heading, and that will be the last leg, maybe to continue the loss of land by the Maasai. And this has resulted to changing landscapes. And those changing landscapes have had some consequences in the Maasai way of life. I'm trying to be a bit fast because of time. And these have had a lot of consequences to the Maasai way of life, to their cultures, to their livelihoods, to their social way of life. And this is particularly so now in the advent of climate change, because what we are experiencing and what we have experienced in the past few years is a situation by the community so vulnerable to the changes of climate. Perhaps that is not so much pronounced here, but in talking of indigenous peoples who borders on their natural environment and are using the natural resources in their daily lives, every slight change will have a lot of consequences in their way of life. And maybe Africa might not be contributing so much to the whole debacle of global warming, but we are definitely on the receiving end in terms of consequences that's arising out of it. There have been a lot of droughts, dry spells that are longer than it has always been, or a lot of floods, that is really putting a lot of stress on the environment and on people's livelihoods. And so we have had changing pasture lands. So if you combine the issue of climate change and the land issue, it will even worsen the situation. Because, for example, the Maasai need a bigger area for their, movement with the livestock to better adapt to the environment. Like when there's drought, you can move your cows. They are nomadic, so they move to other regions. But now the demarcation of land and closing of these corridors, migration corridors, you have enclosed them to a place whereby they become so vulnerable. So there is shrinking of pasture lands and also strained water resources. And this is really affecting the Maasai community. This has scattered pastoralism, as I have said. It is very hard now to move, with the livestock. So we are enclosed. And then what has come up again also as a result of the changing landscapes is the competing land use systems. When other people comes into the land, they would want to use that land in a way that they think can make economic sense to them. Because the whole issue here and the differences in our ideologies and thinking is that we as the Maasai and as indigenous peoples at large, we don't really look so much on land and natural resources only in economic sense, but also on so many other values. There are so many values. Unfortunately, this is not quantified in monetary terms, but it's good maybe someone can come up with a way of measuring, that attachment that you have to the nature, the peace that you get when you are there with nature, and all that kind of stuff. The spirituality that connects you with that environment, and so. That's the differences that we have with the newcomers. So there are competing land use systems. And there is also an increasing food insecurity. So for over the years, there's been a lot of famine, there's a lot of starvation in some areas because the land no longer is as productive as it used to be. And it is now smaller and reduced, and the environment maybe that we occupy cannot offer as much as it used to. So another problem of dividing this land, this is semi-arid area, and if you subdivide it further in smaller units, these units become economically unviable because you cannot actually do something really meaningful with it. And so this has increased food insecurity in the communities. It's also really increased loss of biodiversity and species. As I have said, the whole concept of land tenure system, the laws that have been put in place has increasingly led to loss of biodiversity, loss of wildlife even. So much wildlife species are no longer there. And so there is really need to look again and rethink, are these conservation policies really working? And so this is a concern to our communities, because we value nature and we value biodiversity and wildlife, and so it's really a very big concern. But again, there is conflict over diminished resources, either between the Maasai's and the community and wildlife. There's a lot of human-wildlife conflict, because we all compete for the same resources, for water, for pasture, and our livestock. And especially now with the conventional tourism, which has made the community see wildlife as more of a liability, because they are not benefiting from what's coming through in the tourism income. And Kenya, one of the biggest foreign exchange earner is tourism, actually. So, and I can say maybe 70% of these tourism activities happen around Maasai Land. And so, and these communities are benefiting the least from what is going through tourism activities. So that makes them look into the whole issue of wildlife as more of a liability than an asset to them. And this has led to conflicts, and also conflict between communities themselves. Because if water sources are diminished, and everybody now would want to survival for the fittest. So you have to really fight, and some communities are really fighting in a very brutal way. So competition and conflicts there, reduced water sources, as you can see, a lot of people and livestock are using the same pond to get water, not very clean, but nevertheless, it's a necessity. And also the wildlife using the same. And so there are a lot of competition there and conflicts. And all these relate to land.
So one of the things that we're really quite committed to then is essentially beginning to think about how it is that we can begin to represent ourselves in terms of our academic role, our tribal role, and our professional role. All of these are sort of a way to metaphorically indicate exactly the kinds of initiatives that we've been working on for the last decade or so. And you can see when you begin to sort of put it into this kind of stream that it's not only cumulative, but it's also in a way trying to bridge a lot of things that are really necessary for building both visibility and developing us in terms of how we prioritize these things, not only to represent our interests, but also within the general field as well too. So, as was indicated by the previous two presentations, we always begin with acknowledging how it is that what we call traditional knowledge, traditional science, those things carried by our ancestors that really, in a sense, give us this sense of place. And place is so important and dominant with regards to the way that we think about this and how it is that we go about looking at this concept of DVU, because it's a very simple relationship. If a community maintains itself successively over generations, over time, it can't help but eventually begin to develop a worldview. And that worldview essentially answers one question, which is why do we exist, and what is our relationship to the place that we're at? And that land and place really, in a sense, are sort of synonymous with regards to a lot of the concepts that we like to banter around within the profession, like sustainability and land and practice and so on and so forth, because some of these principles, in a sense, are really important in terms of how it is that we see our role and the continuation of our place in terms of what we inherit and how we feel our children are going to inherit these places. So I won't go into any of the real specifics of this, but just know that our people in the past were very much curious, I guess, in a way. And in fact, you see a lot of these kinds of things that are attendant to migration, the idea of worldview, the idea of emergence, all these kinds of things. And the way that we sort of understand that in terms of how we place ourselves is that our people are continually learning. And that migration, the idea of going to the four corners of the world and learning things, in a sense brings together this concept of what we call transformational knowledge. And it basically means that as a collective society, every time we go and experience something, It used to be the case then that we would selectively bring back things and adapt them in order to help with the survivability of our community. And when we talk about colonialism and post-colonialism, it's basically the disruption of that kind of connection. Because now we're so infused with people coming in and telling us what we have to do, what we have to be in order to transform ourselves into the other, that then it essentially then erodes and really undercuts our notion of what is sustainability from the standpoint of our culture, our community, our lands, and so forth. And as had been indicated before, I would sort of modify a little bit and say that we actually did have hard boundaries when it came to the lands that we occupy. Certainly maybe this is a Pueblo perspective, but one of the things that is really also very much within the discussion of the profession is how is it that we sustain our communities on the basis of the ecosystems that we actually are necessary in order to maintain any kind of community. And this particular map, which was done by one of our northern Pueblo communities, sort of demonstrates that, because there is a boundary, and that boundary is really attended to what are all the necessary things in the ecology to be able to sustain ourselves: the watershed, the farming areas, the mountains, the agricultural lands. All these things have a specific thing, and then beyond those, you have other communities that are also, in a way, bordering on this as well too, in terms of the area that's necessary to sustain them. And similarly, we're also very cognizant of the fact that the way we position ourselves is through an understanding of what we call sacred geography. And we also acknowledge and take instructions from the fact that these types of elements that we simply can call cardinal orientations, star orientations, all these kinds of elements, in a sense, are instructions which are very much attuned to and connected to with regards to how we position ourselves within the landscape. And then finally, we look at it from the standpoint of social staging as well too. In this particular case, you see moieties there, summer moiety, winter moiety, and in a temperate climate such as ours, then that society is really attuned to the fact of how is it then that these moieties take care of maintaining the cycle of renewal throughout the year, and that everybody has a responsibility to do that, and that this then assures that we can predict what it is that's going to be necessary, as well as what's going to happen in the future. I think just as a sort of side note, when we talk about climate change, we're seeing the disruption of this pattern. And in fact, we've heard other indigenous people begin to talk about the fact that even if a community is well stated in terms of their traditional knowledge, that now that traditional knowledge cannot be attuned to the way that climate is affecting the impact, so that it's not necessarily the case anymore, that this will help sustain it because that knowledge is no longer connected to that kind of climate change. So sustainability, culture, all of these then add up in terms of how it is that we uniquely imprint ourselves and how we position ourselves within the world, and where it is that we occupy that niche in terms of the places that we occupy. So when I go through my ABCs, my 101s with my students about how it is that we should think about these critical relationships, I think in terms of the kind of resources that we ourselves have inherited and our responsibility in terms of how we actually be able to maintain these. And by and large, I think that a lot of people will agree that have looked at these kinds of Indian relationships or Native Indigenous relationships, that we pretty much had our conversations attuned to natural resources. If you look at the law, if you look at the progress that tribes have made, by and large, it's attuned to the natural resources that they themselves manage, and they seem to be growing stronger and critical in certain areas. But you talk to a tribe, and the first thing that they'll say is it's all about our natural resources. The thing, however, that I also feel is a necessary component is our human resources, and that's where the conversation is really shortchanged. Because, as indicated before, we operate by something called membership, which is an artificial kind of situation. I think it's talked about raising women. And in that sense, that's the human resource component, because the way that we stage ourselves is that we come into this world and we inherit those things that our ancestors gave to us, as well as our parents, in terms of how it is that we're going to assume the role of our children inheriting things. And it's fixed. Tribes essentially then have children that are born in very rare situations where they actually inherit and adopt today in a contemporary standpoint. So it's sort of like what you see is what you get. So every child that's born into the community should be the most precious kind of commodity that comes into our community. But on the other hand, we actually look at the way that unfortunately the sort of post-colonial insidious part of tribal government has come in. Oftentimes they're discredited, and you see a lot of dysfunction in the community, which I think is really probably the most critical thing that we have to attend to in terms of looking forward about what we're going to have to do and intervene in order to do this. So the conjunction of that, the natural resources and the human resources, is community, and community really then is the bond. So the model that we have begun to sort of look at in terms of how we go about thinking about transformation and dealing with adaptation and change is what we call the 7 generations model. And this is a schematic of a beautiful Anasazi area, ruin that's called Pueblo Benito, that's in Chaco Canyon. And this was abandoned about 1400 AD. And what's interesting about it is that they're still trying to uncover the sort of scientific interpretation in the valley, when of course a lot of the Pueblos have a lot of ancestral knowledge that's attuned to this, but it's a very sophisticated community. And what's interesting about this is that in the conversation about how it is that this place came to be, one of the things that the archaeological record has uncovered is the fact that it actually took 140 years to complete, and it was done in 7 stages. So if we do the math, that's about 20 years. 20 years is approximately 1 generation. But the reason why we think about the 7 generations model as being attuned to this kind of process is, imagine in our society, if we were to understand the fact that we could begin something and then not to see it, not to see us live long enough to see it in completion, that then what is it that's necessary in order to be able to make it so compelling that the generations which come after you don't lose the vision and the sight of it. So you start something that you know you're not going to see its completion in your lifetime, but your children will, and it comes out with something as beautiful as this and as complete as this, is that sort of idea of how we talk about community development within our areas. So we've heard some of the principles of land tenure. Probably the most basic one that drives this is the right of inheritance. The idea that land is not private property, but that in fact it's something that you inherit, that you maintain, and that who are those that are going to benefit are yourself, but also those children that are going to come. It changes the whole perspective of how it is that you look about land, but at the same time, being in a profession that's very much attuned to things such as, well, then how do you manage land, how do you put it into ownership, how do you maximize its utility, so on and so forth. We deal with mainstream principles that are called land use. So in our idea of indigenous planning then, it's basically how do we begin to model this, and indigenous planning then becomes really nothing more than how do you culturally inform the way that you go about community development, and how do you actually reclaim that in a process that has been disrupted from something that has been really very clear and evident before to now things that are really dysfunctional, and in a sense sort of have to require reattuning how it is that we think about how we do things for ourselves. And just as a small pitch, there's one of my books over there on the table called Reclaiming Indigenous Planning. There's one copy, so I'll sign it if somebody buys it. So just very quickly, in 5 minutes, I'll just show you a very example of how we actually apply that in practice. So this just is a general map of the projects that we've got ongoing. There's actually a few more on there as well, but the one that I just want to focus on is this one in Isla del Sur, which is in the southern part of Mexico, actually in El Paso, Texas. And they came to us and basically asked our assistance in helping them to develop a corridor plan. And they basically were a tribe that had been displaced. There's a number of tribes in the 1680 Pueblo Revolt. They moved en masse to the area that is now El Paso, Texas. They were relatively protected and intact, except for the last 30, 20 years where a lot of suburban development that has now encroached within the area. And they're really concerned about how it is that they maintain themselves in the face of a lot of the kind of practices that have disrupted the Maasai and also the ones that the Indian Land Tenure Institute deals with in terms of the loss of land. But in this particular case, then also complicated by the fact that now you've got encroachment of lots of urbanization within their area. So we had a series of conversations, and I just want to sort of highlight this as an example of how you can apply 7 generations planning in order to sort of refocus what is it that really communities themselves value about their own selves and how it is that they use that as a way in order to help inform how they go about community development. So one of the things that we advocate for is public participation, and that role is absolutely strategic and vital because the way that we see 7 generations is that all the voices that are represented in the community are can be staged in terms of 7 generations. So there's, say, myself as the middle generation, then I've got my parents, and then my grandparents, and then my great-grandparents, and then I've got my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and you map that out. There's 3 before, there's 3 after. But the most important thing about that is that in many of our communities, all of them are present in those roles. So the challenge is how are they represented in any kind of conversation about what their community should be and how it actually serves them throughout their lifetime. So from that conversation then, we began to generate, well then how is it that we actually map out that life cycle within a community? And very quickly, you see then that this life cycle is circular, but if you sort of roll it on its axis in a straight line like this, it actually turns into this sine curve. It's physics, it's math, we all don't get too weird on us, but nonetheless, it's really kind of an interesting geometric relationship. So the idea then is that as a person goes from birth to their teen years, to their adult years, to their elder years, that they also then begin to evolve certain kinds of values that they inherit as part of that natural process. So at birth, they begin to gain meaning, they deal with their values, they learn language, tradition, and then as adults, they have responsibility, and then they begin parenting, and then as elders, then they begin to inherit knowledge, and they become memory, and then they become the teachers. Well, in that conversation of how a person goes through the life cycle, then the challenge that we brought to the community is what institutions do you have that actually help to support and affirm that? And whether or not they actually exist, whether they're still in concept, and how then can you use this as a way to sort of stage the kind of ways that the community responds to any of these needs as a person goes through this life cycle in the community. So this timeline then is what we would call the Western linear timeline. But the way that we began to then deconstruct it for the community is to say, what have you got there? And sure enough, lo and behold, we hear that, well, we've got this active learning center, we've got this nation building club, we've got this multi-generational place that we're developing, a gardening, landscaping initiative, a social senior activity center, and that all these institutions then are very much and can be aligned and attuned to this life cycle within the community. So this was the big wake-up moment, the light-bulb moment within the community, because it finally put the idea of why do we build the institutions that we do, and what is it then that are really key and central in terms of their mission as far as supporting the life cycle of every individual within the community. We also dealt with just basic land use issues and said, why is it that the community has evolved the way that it has? This red area is the actual boundary that was the historic land area. They've lost everything except these yellow areas that are there, and then we also did analysis and identified where the purple areas are that represent opportunity. They're looking strategically at reacquiring land. So we said, it's not going to happen overnight, but hey, we have the possibility of being able to reclaim these. The other thing that we were also very much involved with is what we call placemaking. How is it that the landscape itself, as it exists, really then can help to represent your values, deal with all sorts of issues, such as public safety, dealing with canopies in terms of mitigating the environmental issues, dealing with architectural standards, dealing with how it is that people come in there so that we get away from this idea of you're now on federal land, keep out, abide by tribal laws. Some of you that have been on reservations always sort of think of it in this kind of negative thing, but instead saying that when a person comes into this place, how do you actually announce it without using signage and saying you're in a very special place to behave yourself because you're in a place that matters to this community. So the wonderful thing about being in an architecture and design in planning school is we can take the reality of this and then we can develop ways in order to represent them in terms of portfolios, which then can be leveraged by the community in order to be able to get the assets that they need to transform in the way that they want to. So just to make sure that, it represents a lot of amenity that's put in there. We also kept our little res dog there so that you know that we're in Indian territory. It's a big inside joke, sorry. Anyone that's laughing is Chris. But the other thing that we also found out in this process is the fact that one of the things that was the first